So Mark told me to do a bit at the beginning of this video, just to, as a little, because all the way through I was like, you've left the best bits till last. All the best bits are at the end, and why don't you put the best bits at the beginning? So I said nobody's going to get through all that to get to the best bits. So just to let you know, all the academic lectury stuff, lots of long stuff that I don't understand is at the beginning, and then it gets really, 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 really good about halfway through to towards the end. So Mark said, put something funny at the beginning of the video, and I can't think of anything funny other than just rewind to the middle. No, don't listen to it. Mark's very clever. He's very clever and very, very intellectual, but it does get better. Are you listening to me outside the door?
Yeah. Okay, so this is the what I wrote for a lecture I did for a university in Portugal. Haven't done any academic things for a long time, so it was a bit of going back to stuff that I did over the years that became my book, The Lost Child. So it was framed a lot more for an academic audience, if you like, although I was trying to drop in some truth bombs along the way, so I can maybe digress as I go through a little bit for my more intelligent audience, open to different ideas that I maybe didn't want to go into detail at the university, although I think the things that I researched and came up with during my book and academia was all relevant to what I know now about the, what should we say, conspiracies, for want of a better term. So as I looked more and more into the lost child figure from my undergraduate days, and as it went through postgraduate, I saw more and more how widespread the lost child figure is, and I'm mainly looking at books, films, TV series, the cultural representations of lost children, but of course, sadly, real life cases of children being killed, abducted, abused are all too prevalent. But one thing I realised was that even though there was a massive proliferation of images and narratives of lost children, the vast majority of cases, real cases, are not reported widely or even at all in the media at large, and do not have the focus from institutions and law enforcement that a handful of high profile cases have had. And in fact, as I'll discuss, institutions in many countries have actively participated in or allowed children to be taken from homes and families. An EU report on the numbers of missing children in member states gives a figure of 96,341 cases in the UK in 2012, although this is only dated from 30 of the 54 police forces. The scoping report into missing children of 2011, commissioned by Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre, states that in 2009 to 2010 there were about 230,000 missing children cases. Missing person cases involving children under the age of 18. Another figure says 250,000 children go missing in Europe every year. So where I go back to very early stories, fairy tales, folk stories, the beginnings in oral stories which have been passed through generation across multitudes of communities across the world. Joseph Campbell has written extensively about the common themes that are shared across many cultures, and he's argued that they reveal archetypes that resonate on a deep level with humans from diverse backgrounds. Carl Gustav Jung has also argued that there are archetypes that connect to a shared subconscious that reveal aspects within individuals and also society and communities as a whole. Fairy tales are in our DNA and are themed through literature down the ages. So there are references in the later novels from 20th century up till today that I'll be discussing in the lecture. The writer Jack Zipes asserts that the nature of fairy tales is to provide guidance on social action to transform the world and make it more adaptable to human needs while we try to change ourselves and make ourselves fit for the world, because we are all misfit for the world and we need to invent or find the means through communication to satisfy and resolve conflicting desires and instincts. But I would ask, as the author Janet Frame asks in her novel Towards Another Summer, why are so many stories of boys and girls who set out with a message or to make a journey and never deliver the message or reach the end of the journey because they're seized by wolves or foxes? She identifies an abiding message that her young self internalised, that many boys and girls over the years, other people, individually or collectively, will try to prevent the child from fulfilling his or her quest. These people are not necessarily the predatory strangers lurking in the shadows that we're warned not to talk to, although they definitely exist, but evil can lurk amid the familiar in the shadows of the home and the institutions and people in positions of trust and authority. The times have not changed for the better. In 2014, Marina Warner refers to the unspeakable, unbelievable acts which are spoken of in fairy and folk tales and are now, quote, echoed week by week in the news. When a child dies at the hands of parents who starved and tortured him, as in the case of Daniel Pelker, and nobody moves to help him. When young girls are kidnapped and held prisoner by an apparently ordinary man in an ordinary American suburb, and when Joseph Fritzl imprisons his daughter in a cellar and keeps her there for 24 years, fathering 7 children on her until he was discovered in 2008, then fairy tales can be recognised as witness to every aspect of human nature. They also act to alert us, or hope to. Warner argues that the function of fairy tales in the past was to say the unsayable in a way which encoded them cryptically for the younger generation to absorb. In the current age, children as well as adults can watch the horrors unfold in the media, though, quote, recognition and familiarity of the possibility does not seem to have sharpened sensitivity or produced change, only increased a general fear for children's safety. So the imaginary has become the real, and the barrage of images of the horrors inflicted on children seems only to increase the propensity to lose children in our society. Jack Zipes said fairy tales compel storytellers and listeners alike to explore the Freudian question of why humans are so discontent with civilization. A few years ago, Zipes translated for the first time into English the very first edition of Grimm's fairy tales. As subsequent editions were rewritten and various tales heavily edited or even omitted completely, particularly by Wilhelm Grimm, who tried to make the tales conform to his sentimental Christianity and puritanical ideology, and also more artistic to appeal to middle-class reading audiences. Zipes asserts that the original tales of the first edition are often about wounded young people, and many illustrate ongoing conflicts that continue to exist in our present day. Those tales in the first edition are, quote, not told for children, nor can they be considered children's tales. They are about children, so we see the beginnings of the child as representation symbol. The tales are about exploitation and oppression of young people, dangerous predators, spiteful kings and queens abusing their power. And at this point I put up the image which you'll see on screen of two lovely people, and now King Charles and Jimmy Savile, and I sort of threw that up at the quote, kings and queens abusing their power and dangerous predators, because I thought it was quite pertinent that Zipes was talking about those in the same sentence about fairy tales, and as we know, we have the deep links between royalty and paedophiles. The literalisation of the original oral tales often came with a manipulation of the narratives. Words that had been spoken and were part of an organic community consciousness could then be used to direct the imaginations of generations of children. Bettelheim condemned Perrault's version of Little Red Riding Hood because he turned it into a morality tale, a warning for young girls, particularly not to break the rules and succumb to temptations and desires. Zipes also pointed out that the original oral tales, although having variations, in general gave agency to the young Red Riding Hood, making her the hero who saves herself, whereas Perrault's version has the girl as the victim of her waywardness who requires rescue from a woodcutter. The effect of social deprivation is portrayed in several fairy tales with reference to the lack of food. In both Hansel and Gretel and the Children of Famine, the impoverished and starving parents are driven to sacrifice their children in order to survive. The threat of starvation has its correlation in scenes where children are cooked and eaten, or it's threatened, a frequent motif across ancient myths and tales. The catchily named tales, How Some Children Played at Slaughtering from Grimm's first edition, which were edited out completely from later editions, can't imagine why, refers to children being killed as if they were pigs. If you go back further to the legend of Philomel and Procne in the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is also the storyline reproduced by Shakespeare in Titus Andronicus, the wrong sisters serve up the king's son for him to unknowingly eat. In the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel, the parents do not threaten to eat their children, they simply plan to abandon them to their deaths in the forest. They are, however, threatened with becoming dinner for the wicked witch, who they encounter while lost in the forest, who plans to cook them. The witch's house is made of cake and sweets, or gingerbread, and making it a place of danger could be seen as a way for impoverished parents to ward off the longings of their children for unobtainable luxuries. For Bettelheim, his psychoanalytic reading of the tale includes the child's need to transcend the primitive orality symbolised by the children's infatuation with the gingerbread house. Bettelheim is a Freudian psychoanalyst background, and so he sees it as having an important message for a child who wants to cling on to his parents, even though the time has come for meeting the world on his own. The tale gives body to his anxieties and offers reassurance about these fears. While this may have some validity, I'm struck by the primary plot device being the parents' choice to abandon their children to die, a choice they are driven to by the extreme poverty of their situation. I think the anxieties and fears which Bettelheim refers to may not be worked out in the positive way he describes. The child may instead internalise the financial material burden which she places on her parents, a burden she can alleviate by absenting herself from the family, perhaps by going out and earning money, or perhaps simply by not being alive. In Thomas Hardy's novel Jude the Obscure, the young son known as Little Father Time feels the burden of his parents' poverty and kills himself and his siblings. He leaves a suicide note saying, "Done because we are too many." Excuse me. Carolyn Steedman published a story which a group of young girls had written while she was a school teacher. It was all part of a project, and the children themselves called it the Tidy House, and included angry mothers who complained to their children that life was harder because of them. This attitude would obviously be passed from generation to generation, so potentially those young girls would have become mothers and continue the cycle. Narratives of lost children are perhaps the starkest, most powerful way to convey themes of poverty and social exclusion. They draw attention to the brutal realities of life in the time in which they were written, but they sadly also reflect realities for children and their families in our own era also. Why is eating children so prevalent in cultural history? Is it a desire to incorporate the child back within the adult as a macabre, symbolic reclamation of the lost child? The motif has meanings that change over time. Jonathan Swift, in his satire A Modest Proposal in 1729, writes that the starving Irish people should sell their babies to the rich in England to be eaten. and this is to criticise changes in commercial life, colonial policies, the corruption of the state. A child's position of vulnerability as the weakest in society means their ill treatment shows cruelty in sharper focus. McDonough discusses how child murder was a frequent occurrence in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, and when child victims of the growing industries are also considered, Swift's satire is not a great exaggeration of the truth. Society was consuming children to feed itself. The burden of poor children is ingrained in our consciousness, so it becomes a part of government, national policy, often hidden, to rid us of these burdens. In David Malouf's novel Remembering Babylon, Jemmy is a young child victim of the Industrial Revolution in Britain and its colonial expansion, washed up on the shore of what had become Australia after being thrown overboard, living amongst an Aboriginal tribe until he reaches adulthood, when he discovers British settlers who look like people in his memories from childhood. They first view him as merely a fragment of tea tree swamp, some bit of the land over there that was forbidden to them. In the opening of the novel, imagination and history interweave around the lost child figure in a setting of early European colonisation of Australia. The character Jemmy bursts into a remote British settlement in the Australian outback in the middle of an imaginative children's narrative, a make-believe game elaborated from a story in the 4th grade reader. The game has elements of European folk tales, with Lachlan imagining hunting wolves in a snowy forest in Russia, though it stems from a school book embedded in specific historical context, and the novel offers two versions of time, the time of history and the time of the folk imagination and folk memory. The opening of Malouf's novel posits the return of the lost child within an unsettling conjunction of these two fundamental forms of narrative, folk stories and the overarching narratives of history. Randall has analysed how the novel's first sentence places the events in chronological history in the middle of the 19th century, when settlement in Queensland had advanced little more than halfway up the coast, and then it begins with "one day," a phrase not very far from the once upon a time of a traditional fairy tale. So Jemmy is presented as between world and imagination, narrative and time. The lost child returned. Jemmy is from the outset an ambiguous space around and through which communal and individual narratives are manifested and collide, offering both a manifestation of the negative fears of the external world and a new positive insight into the world, depending on how the character's imagination responds to him as a catalyst. And for me, that ambiguous, disruptive, possibly visionary space is intrinsic to the lost child archetype. I would argue it is an archetype. And the early life of this character in this particular novel, Remembering Babylon, Jemmy Fairley, vividly portrays the social and economic conditions of the poor during this time. He remembers it as if it was a bad dream, being maggot-like creature who had to crawl around with a brush under factory machinery. He had been, quote, one of an army of little shitty creatures, mere bundles of rag and breath, but with hands that could clasp a broom and strength enough to push it, whose job it was, for all the hours of daylight, to crawl about in the low place under the machines in the timber mill, sweeping sawdust into wooden pans. So Jemmy is a victim of the Industrial Revolution, which would develop the power of Britain, which then led to their enhancement of empire. He's regarded merely as a cog in the machinery. Jemmy's first words to the settlers, and Jemmy's only direct speech in the novel, are "Do not shoot, I am a British object." The words are taken from the memoirs of a real character, or real person rather, Jemmy Murrell, known as James Murrells, who had been shipwrecked in the mid-19th century and reportedly lived for 17 years with Aboriginal groups. But obviously playing around with the idea of whether you're someone being an object or a subject, a sovereign person. Karl Marx's Das Kapital refers to the child slavery that was a staple of capitalist production in the Industrial Revolution. Marx quotes Fielden's contemporary account, which describes how the small and nimble fingers of little children were in high demand to work within the newly invented machinery, and were flogged, fettered and tortured in the most exquisite refinements of cruelty. Marx himself remarks on the necessity of child stealing and child slavery for the transformation of manufacturing exploitation into factory exploitation. As one of these children, Jemmy was a victim of the same machine which expanded the empire into colonies throughout the world and subjugated indigenous populations. So I'm arguing basically that lost children, the making of lost children is at the heart of everything, regarding the empire and the power of capitalist society, just society really, not to use terms capitalist or whatever, just power, exploiting the lowest and most vulnerable to create extra power and control. Jemmy's experience has some similarities with the plight of the many children who were abducted, coerced or misled and taken to serve as labourers in the early days of colonisation. To the Americas, to begin with, at the early stages of that. The beginning of child migration stretches all the way back to the early years of empire. In 1618, 100 child migrants, as they called them, were sent by the City of London, so City of London involved from the very beginning, at the request of the Virginia Company to provide labour for the colony. These organised parties in the period up to the 19th century were only sporadic, but there was, alongside this, the widespread abduction of poor children, many of whom had families, from Britain, who were then shipped to the emerging colonies. They were abducted from streets and the countryside. One contemporary account stated that in the dead of night, children were taken by force from the beds where they slept, by ruffians who hunted their prey as beasts of the chase. This was known as spiriting, a term which has uncanny connotations alongside such a terrible practice. And I think it quite striking and disturbing that it's given that term, really, something so ephemeral and almost paranormal, but it's describing something that was very real, physical, terrible robbing of life. For those parents whose children were taken, it must have felt like bereavement, as if their children were now ghosts. The children ripped from their homes and taken to a very alien place, the New World. They may also have felt that they had been removed to a different reality. In Remembering Babylon, the returning lost child affects the relationship between the inner world of the self and the external material world of the settlers. Jemmy is regarded as a spirit, a phantom who is outside of the history that defines who the settlers are and their place in the world. Jemmy is made into a mythical, uncanny entity, embodying fears they had themselves supplied from tales they already knew. So again, he's connected with the mythical stories, the fairy tales, which are embedded in the unconscious of everyone. It's perhaps the practice of spiriting which has sunk into the cultural memory and emerged in characters, that are all over popular fiction, like the child catcher in the film Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, Mrs. Coulter and the Gobblers in Philip Pullman's Historic Materials series of books. Characters that abduct children and connected with the power structures within those stories. It's striking that so often stories and films that are designed and presented as entertainment for children are about the abduction and endangerment of children. Attitudes to poor urban children continued to involve the exiling of many of them to what was considered the New World. In the 18th and 19th centuries, and this practice became known as child migration. In its 20th century form, this was the state-approved transport of large numbers of children by various religious groups to institutions in the Commonwealth. In the 20th century also there was significant use of rhetoric that inscribed the migrant children as economic units. In 1911, Bernardo's charity appealed for funds to turn nobody's children into empire builders. In the 1920s, the Church of England Waifs and Strays Society described a party of boys sent to Canada as more links fresh from the forge. And the Prince of Wales in 1934 declared the work of the Fairbridge Farm Schools to be an imperial investment. The British Empire, and maybe much of our world in general, is built on the graves of children. It's a dark void in the foundation of the structures which surround and contain us. The objectification of children occurs throughout history and across borders. Child migration is often compared to the stolen generations, the forced removal of Aboriginal children of mixed race from their parents and communities. Child migration was an attempt to expand the white British stock to plant new roots in foreign countries. The stolen generations were a policy to try and enforce racial superiority by removing mixed-race Aboriginal children from communities to enforce whiteness. At the same time as society celebrated these actions as ways of increasing connections to a mythical origin, it revealed the fundamental lack upon which society was based. In texts about early settlement in Australia, such as Remembering Babylon, the white settlers locate dark malevolence externally in the wilderness they perceive in the unfamiliar landscape. It's this fear of the unknown which reminds the settlers of their disconnection from their past and their origins. The loss that is projected out into the new world is actually a fear of something lost within the self, and the figure of the child, with its joint associations with new beginnings and the adult's own past, represent this. In Australia, in the 19th century, there were many babes in the bush, children of the early white settlers who got lost in the alien wilderness. Peter Pearce discussed the proliferation of such stories, factual and fictional, and asserts that symbolically the lost child represents the anxieties of European settlers because of their ties with home, which they have cut in coming to Australia. In this colonial context, the figure of the child stands in part for the apprehensions of adults about having sought to settle in a place where they might never be at peace. Such anxiety has continued into the present day, although fears of the bush and the unknown, other, have become transplanted to today's largely urban environment. Pearce notes that in 20th century Australia, the agency of the loss of children was now the human rather than the natural world, and purposeful rather than accidental. He notes that the European forests of the Grimm's tales were presented as dangerous because they were a place of human threat, rather than the Australian bush's natural dangers. In the 20th century, after world wars and increasing urbanisation, the experiences of the lost child in reality and fiction are similar. As the most vulnerable victims, the violent loss of a child is particularly disruptive to established social structures and opens up gaps in the ruling narratives of civilization. Together with the stolen generations of Aboriginal children, child migrants were part of the Forgotten Australians, a term for those children who experienced often harsh conditions in institutions or other out-of-home care. A figure of 500,000 children has been given for those kept in care during the 20th century in Australia. This figure includes 7,000 child migrants and 30,000 to 50,000 Indigenous children who are now termed the stolen generations. Pearce argues that the actions of many individuals and institutions in 20th century Australia seem inspired by a nihilistic wish to deny them a future. This is an observation reminiscent of Janet Frame, that so many stories are written of children being attacked before they complete their journey. Just as a side, I'm concentrating on Australia really because that's where my academic sort of studies went at one point. But there are a number of other cases. I've read. I think it came out that during Franco era in Spain there were large numbers of children taken away from their mothers soon after they're born. Mothers were told that their children had died, and then the children were given to families of supporters of the Franco regime. I read as well about African children being taken in Israel and given to white Jewish families. It does seem to be in different forms something that's very widespread. But to go back to Australia, there's a book, Zana Freylon's No Stars to Wish On, which is a novel for children, a relatively recent novel, and it's set around the experience of forgotten Australian children in care in the 20th century. It's got narrative, folkloric elements again, incorporating clairvoyance and a connection between the children and animals. There's also a partial quest by the older child, Amrai, who is left behind when the authorities take the rest of the children away from the extended family. The children are considered to be from poor and immoral backgrounds who require saving. The character Jack makes clear in his first person narrative that he is loved and cared for, in stark contrast to the authoritarian care home. Amrai leaves home in search of the other children, and her journey is described in short passages like a mythical quest. She has visionary powers, including a premonition of the time the children will be taken. Quote, a future without children, and that's something that I'll return to later. She foresees an empty house and barren garden. This resonates with some fairy tales and legends where the loss of offspring is connected to blight on the land. The first person narrator Jack is given the number 49 by the nuns who run the home he has been taken to. All the children are reduced to numbers by the callous nuns who inflict harsh punishments on the children. Jack finds that his predecessor as number 49 died after being injected by doctors to test new vaccines, a practice which is claimed to have occurred in reality. So we have very early connections between pharmaceutical industry and these lost children. The original number 49 was not taken to a hospital. His death was covered up, and one of the children reveals she saw his body being buried in a shallow grave that is covered in rubbish to hide it. I would compare this tragic scene to one in George Eliot's novel Adam Bede, where a character named Hetty Sorrel, a milkmaid seduced and then abandoned by a squire's son, buries her newborn child in a woodpile. She later returns there, haunted by her lost child, and is arrested. Her transgressive femininity can't be reconciled with the ideal of the progressive nation of Britain. MacDonagh argues that Eliot's vision of Britain, which forgets the violent uprisings and injustices which are part of its existence, is like Hetty's burial of her child in a forlorn hope that it will be found and saved. The burial is, quote, an allegorical enactment of the process of nation-making by forgetting. It screens us from the material that it tries to forget. But paradoxically, the screen also acts as a trigger to memories of precisely the material that is repressed. I know it's all a bit of a mouthful, but if you think of the different meanings of screen, the word screen, it could be a covering that hides something from view, you screen something off, or it's a surface from which images are projected out to be seen, like on a television, or also now what we write on a screen on a computer. So I think, the idea is that within the same concept of trying to hide something, you can actually reveal something, and maybe you get part of that where the elites tried to hide things in plain sight, and things are hidden while also being revealed at the same time. Hetty is drawn back to the body of the child, but it's already gone, an absence which incriminates her. In a subliminal reference to the tale of Little Red Riding Hood, Hetty is wearing a red cloak. She's a descendant of Perrault's Riding Hood, vain and susceptible to the male predator, and not the resourceful heroine of many of the original oral tales, who overcomes the wolf herself. Interestingly, Hetty's punishment is exile to the colonies. the scene of much of the British violence which has been disavowed by Eliot's narrative. MacDonagh asserts that meanings are not fixed in any historical moment, but rather travel across them, and makes the analogy with Freud's concept Nachtraglichkeit, in which memories of past experiences are revised in the light of new experiences and development. Nachtraglichkeit suggests a different perspective on time, whereby interpretation of the past can be retrospectively altered, possibly as repressed knowledge of the actual nature of a past experience is revealed. The analogy underlines a disrupted temporality by which frequently the inclusion of a child murder in a text is a moment of puncturing that deflates the even contours of meaning and narrative and the chronology on which they depend. The historical memory borne by the figure of child murder therefore complicates the conventional historical narrative and opens the possibility of counter-histories that question the authority of conventional progressive accounts. The murder of a child ruptures the surface of the text in which it appears by obtruding a narrative of a different kind, introducing the potential for rich interpretive complexity. That's a quote from MacDonagh, and again, it's a bit of a mouthful, but I think on one level, the stories of child murder puncture these idea of like empire, going back to like the British Empire in those old texts being a progressive force, and it was a force for good and very moral and in charge of the world and going out to civilise the natives. And then you had maybe a story about a child murder, and it just punctured this narrative of everything being so strong and powerful and dominating and superior, and it was showing, if you like, the squalor and the deprivation which was at the heart of this supposedly great empire, great progressive force. But I think also it's interesting there, and I'll go into more this idea about time and how about it's disrupting our ideas of time being a chronological series of events, and the lost child is something which disrupts our idea of time being just a linear force that goes from past to future. So I'll go more into that later. So a brief individual life can be used as a symbol for a whole national identity or past, and the figure of the child can signify combinations of inner psychology, a national consciousness, hope for the future, and memories of the past. Let's quote this Caroline Steedman book where she looks at the child figure, and she talks about a search for the self, for a past that's long and gone, and the ways in which over the last 200 years the lost object essence, vision, has come to assume the shape and form of a child. The concept of the child as an image is important. So much of our collective and individual views of what a child is and represents is mediated through images, either in pictures, film or words. Buckingham asserts that the notion of childhood is itself a social historical construction, formed largely by culture and representation. Peter Coveney argues that the child image contains not only the response of the artist to his condition, but the response of a whole society to itself. Individually and socially, this response is often seemingly contradictory. The child is represented as a symbol of growth, life and fertility, as a means for establishing human values in an increasingly secular age, but also frequently as a symbol of dying, as life that's better dead. This impregnation of life with death is inherent in the lost child image. Again, I'll just have an aside to what they're doing now. If you look at things with the Extinction Rebellion, where you've got a number of people who are talking about, it's wrong to have a child because they're producing, they're going to be producing more CO2 and it's going to be damaging for the world, so it's better not to have children. This whole population reduction thing that we know all about it's all this. I think often, well, if you look at where Greta Thunberg has been put forward as the face of that movement, again, a lot of it is about, oh, we need to save the world for our children, but paradoxically, that involves reducing the population of the planet. So we need to save children by killing them in some weird way. But I think that strange paradoxical thing that they're doing with movements like that in the modern day does really tie up with what was just described there about how the child is simultaneously presented as an image of life and something to be saved, while at the same time referring to them, that they're better off dead, or it's better off not to have the child to begin with. So it's a strange way they seem to compress the two things together, so they're both embodied within this child image. Steedman asserts that the idea of the child was the figure that provided the largest number of people living in the recent past of Western societies with the means for thinking about and creating a self, something grasped and understood, a shape moving in the body, something inside, an interiority. Steedman argues that the literary and theoretical creations of a child figure became a central vehicle for expressing ideas about the self and its history through conception, that there was such a thing as childhood focused new forms of attention on actually living and real children from the late 18th century onwards. These real children then influenced imagined children, who in turn were used to represent aspects of real children's lives. So the reality and the imaginary were bound together, as they always will be. Other researchers have also asserted that early modern conceptions of memory and selfhood were connected to ideas of the child, but bound up with developing concepts of trauma and a lack, an absence inside the self that had to be filled. It's the potential, in other words, for the child to become lost, which is essential to a modern psychological identity. A child may represent a person's inner trauma and sense of weakness, and we think of Freud in the early 20th century, and this may then result in children as an embodiment of that vulnerability. In this way, children may actually come to embody what people despise about themselves. And again, to our modern era, we have sadly a proliferation of children suffering from anxiety and depression after the recent nonsense. And I think increasingly children are made to suffer these anxieties, which were previously not pushed upon them, and at too early an age, and this is becoming then something that people grow up and come through into adulthood.
Woolf asserts that for Rousseau,
Just have a pause.
Jacques Rousseau, the old French philosopher, the child was always the object, never the subject of memory. That children could not consciously remember anything of consequence, and yet childhood itself was recognised essentially in remembrance. It's this reclamation of childhood which becomes the source of literature in the form of autobiography. In this conceptualisation, children are made into representations on the page as signifiers of an interior self. Jacques Derrida, much later French philosopher, in his theory of deconstruction, refers to Rousseau's discussion of education in the fictionalised memoir Emile. Although Rousseau lauds nature and the imagination of children, Derrida points out Rousseau's statement that humans need the period of childhood to learn how to get on in the world. So there is a lack within the natural, within the child, which must be filled. Derrida then develops this to say the scandal is when a child uses the power of the sign to make people do what they want. Conversely, children become unmanageable if they think of people as tools to supplement their own weakness and learn to move the world by simply moving the tongue. Derrida interprets this last phrase as quote, the power of substitution that permits us to absent ourselves and act by proxy through representation through the hands of others, through the written. This substitution always has the form of the sign. The scandal is that the sign, the image, or the representer become forces and make the world move. I would say this is another example of how children emerge with representation, either images or signs, and at the same time they are embodying a lack, an absence, an emptiness, and they are perceived as manipulative and possibly destructive. There has been this contradictory double nature in the representations of children and social attitudes to them. On the one hand, innocent, vulnerable, our most delicate aspect of humanity which needs to be protected, on the other something evil to be feared, carrying some intimation of all our weaknesses. The character Kevin in Lionel Shriver's novel We Need to Talk About Kevin encapsulates this lack and deviousness, a child who is emptiness. Kevin kills 7 of his fellow students. Kevin does not care for any part of the world as it's constructed, believes it all to be stupid and irrelevant, and casually wants to tear it up. Like a small child picking apart a toy till it's in a myriad pieces. In many ways he's a successor to the many fictional demon children that have been spawned in popular culture. His mother Eva remarks in the novel on the revulsion she perceives from people in the street when she's pregnant. She asks why so many films portray pregnancy as infestation, as colonization by stealth. Rosemary's Baby was just the beginning. In Alien, a foul extraterrestrial claws its way out of John Hurt's belly. In Mimic, a woman gives birth to a 2-foot maggot. Later, the X-Files turned bug-eyed aliens bursting gorily from human midsections into a running theme. In horror and sci-fi, the host is consumed or rent, reduced to husk or residue so that some nightmare creation may survive its shell. End of quote. Of course, Rosemary's Baby was not the beginning, but merely an adaptation of ancient legends of succubus and changelings. This passage illustrates my argument that child has been reviled and feared, at least in equal measure to, and often concurrent with, feelings of reverence and love. People are perhaps secretly repulsed that children stand outside the structures that enclose them and resent it, or else resent themselves for bringing children into this terrible, corrupting world. Even Eva's normally patriotic husband in the novel exasperatedly says that this whole country is anti-child. Jen Webb discusses Shriver's admission that the novel is partly a critique of America, and extends this to argue that it is also a critique of global society dominated by American doctrines. Quote, Eva, Franklin and Kevin exemplify not just the absence at the heart of discourses of the family, but the emptiness of the rhetoric of freedom and democracy and silence about the violence of global capital. Webb argues that Kevin is the gap that lies below, indeed that forms the foundation of the notions of family, nation and meaning. Kevin stands for nothing but absence. So I would say he's a lost child who disrupts the signifiers which we base our realities on, the power struggles within relationships, families and countries. He is lost not as a victim himself, but as a representative of all that is missing from the world. Quote, silences and absences, the gap between how things are and how they seem to be, between the United States and the rest of the world, between representation and reality. From Jen Webb. In We Need to Talk About Kevin, Eva describes how Kevin not only pretended he couldn't speak up to the age of 3, he also withheld his knowledge of written language. When he finally sits down and writes out perfectly words from his grade school primer, he exposes its, quote, insidious nihilism. His handwriting has no character, no personality, it's merely a copy, a repetition which reveals the nothingness that lies beneath language. Quote, from the point he admitted he knew how, his printing unerringly unerringly replicated the examples in his textbook with no extra tails or squiggles. His T's were crossed and I's dotted, and never before had the bloated interior of B's and O's and D's seemed to contain so much empty space. Empty space within the letters is a metaphor for this nothingness, an emptiness which could also sum up Kevin's attitude to human life. Kevin is himself the absence between representation and reality, signifier and signified. Webb argues that Kevin's refusal to play the game of representation, stripping away the veneer of discourse to show there is nothing behind it, reveals what linguists and philosophers already know, of course. Signs are empty and take on meaning only when people agree to pretend together that they have content. Again, going back to Jacques Derrida, he asserts that language has within its structure an absence because it is communicating something to those who are absent. Even the person writing is making signs which will have effects beyond his presence and beyond the present actuality of his meaning, even beyond his death. Writing, even speaking, requires a breaking presence, death, or the possibility of the death of the addressee, and this therefore disrupts the authority of the code as a finite system of rules. Kevin is an extreme representation of the manipulative child who Rousseau wrote about and Derrida related to the scandal of the sign. From his birth, when he rejects his mother's milk and screams continuously in her presence, only to be quiet immediately when his father arrives, she sees him as deliberately manipulative. Kevin is a character who represents the child lost to society, who reacts against it, a delinquent who destroys others. He creates a cycle of lost children by killing other young people. He is, by the admission of his author, an embodiment of modern society's emptiness. Kevin's empty act of killing his fellow students has no discernible meaning in any system of signification, except to convey the meaninglessness of life. The loss of a child, whether through death or other enforced absence, is regarded as the most extreme break in presence. As previously argued, the child is also seen as outside of the rules, whether of codified language or of social norms. Kevin's multiple murder breaks the rules while breaking the presence. The way the absence of the lost child eludes a linguistic expression is described in Chris Womersley's novel Bereft. The main character Quinn comes back to his mother in a small Australian town after he ran away at 16, falsely accused of murdering and raping his younger sister Sarah. He was presumed dead, but actually grew to be a man and has just returned from Europe, where he fought in the First World War. Quinn is traumatised from his war experiences, compounding the tragedy of losing his sister so horrifically and having to leave behind his mother. When Quinn sneaks home to talk to his mother, who is slowly dying of an illness, and she makes a comment to her now adult son, who has returned long after she thought he had died, she tells her son how the English language cannot name the traumatic loss of a child. Quote, widows, widowers, orphan, and you know I was already one of those. Do you know, Quinn, there isn't even a word for a parent who has lost a child? Strange, isn't it? You would think, after all these centuries of war and disease and trouble, but no, there is a hole in the English language. It's unspeakable, bereft. Unquote. The centrality of lost children to culture and society is simultaneously disavowed. Despite the continual loss of children through war, disease and, quote, trouble, there has been no evolution or creation of a word specifically to describe a parent who has lost his or her child. This absence caused by the loss of a child causes a hole in the English language, perhaps partly because childhood is intrinsic to the formation of language. The son then tells her about some of his war experiences, and she replies, I take it you didn't see Little Red Riding Hood then, or that damn wolf? He answers that they are only stories, but she insists that stories are rarely only stories. The reference to a European fairy tale, particularly one which has at its heart the damaging of innocence, after mention of war, conveys how the childish stories reveal the basis for the violence within society. Quinn meets and is helped by a young girl called Sadie, who is like a throwback to the early versions of Red Riding Hood, resourceful and described as being able to transform herself into animals to escape capture. She crosses the boundaries of reality and imagination and could be regarded as a feral child, living wild, although she has only recently run away from the town where her mother died. She becomes a legend herself after leaving the town. One of the stories the townspeople tell of her is she gave birth to a rabbit. Her surname is Fox, in further allusion to fairy tales, and also her crossing of boundaries between child and wild animal. Feral children have long been a subject of mythology, from Romulus and Remus, the mythical founders of Rome, to Tarzan. But there are numerous examples also of real children who have been abandoned or abused by their family or community and have managed to survive through interacting with animals. When I was writing my book, a young girl had been discovered living with monkeys in northern India. She couldn't speak but made screeching noises and walked on all fours. It was stated in a news report that many in India are comparing the little girl to Mowgli, the character from Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book, who was raised by wolves. An interesting connection in literary terms and also in relation to the country's colonial past. The challenge to our conceptions of human difference and superiority over other animals, and the belief that language is a bastion of this separation, mean that such cases still exert a troubling but powerful fascination. One of the most famous historical feral children is Victor, known as the Wild Boy of Aveyron, who was discovered in a forest in France in 1800. He is the inspiration for the child character in David Malouf's first novel, An Imaginary Life. In this 1978 novel, Malouf imagines the life of the Roman poet Ovid after his exile in AD 8 to a remote colony called Tomis. From the small amount of information available from the time historically, Malouf created an imaginary life. As the novel progresses, its centre becomes a wild boy, a feral child whom Ovid encounters while out with a hunting party from the village of his exile. The child exists outside of human language and society and is therefore in a state undifferentiated from nature. This makes the child an archetype for the romantic ideal associated with Rousseau, Wordsworth and other notable figures of Romanticism. Ovid's relationship with the feral child introduces the poet to a greater understanding of the physical world and his own self by taking him outside of the established structures of language and literacy. In An Imaginary Life, it is language outside of the normal social structure that reveals a collapse of difference between self and other, human and universe. Quote, "The true language I know now is that speech in silence in which we first communicated, the child and I, in the forest when I was asleep. It is the language I used with him in my childhood, a language my tongue rediscovers and which would, I believe, reveal the secrets of the universe to me. When I think of the tongue that has been taken away from me, it is some earlier and more universal language than our Latin. Latin is a language for distinctions. Every ending defines and divides. The language I am speaking of now, that I am almost speaking, is a language whose every syllable is a gesture of reconciliation. We knew that language once. I spoke it in my childhood. We must discover it again." Unquote. This passage is a very romantic description of a language inherent in children, which is presented as being holistic and undifferentiated from the material world, and also a metaphysical infinite. This innate language is contrasted to the constructed language on which an empire is based, an empire which must divide and rule and impose a hierarchy on its subjects. At the end of An Imaginary Life, the feral child who is outside of language and structured human society walks off the page as the narrative ends with Ovid's death. Jemmy too, in Remembering Babylon, effectively absents himself from the narrative, walking off the settlement, never to be seen again, except in possible rumoured sightings that he may have been killed in one of the massacres of Aborigines. Both characters are moving outside of the narrative, off of the page. Derrida says death strolls between letters. I would say the lost child moves between letters, through and beyond our means of signification, to disrupt how we perceive ourselves. This can be negative, often is, and I believe the established power structures that often use it, the fear and anxiety, to control us. But this gap, the hole in language, the space between our constructed selves, who we were born as, the child within us, can be a window, a portal to an enhanced state of being. Janet Frame, the author, as well as referencing feral children outside of social and linguistic structures, also included many silent children in her novels, who couldn't or wouldn't speak. Frame often combines the apocalyptic and dystopian with the visionary, and the crux of both extremes is frequently a mute or disabled child, usually a girl. Frame uses mute children to symbolise a gap in history in a similar way to MacDonald's theory that child murder disrupts established narratives and seeks to incorporate the gaps, the silence, into consciousness. In Frame's posthumously published novel, Towards Another Summer, there's a passage referring to the incoherent singing of a child. Quote, "Because, reaching God, we are wordless, why grow afraid and stop in our journey? Why not continue singing at first, as Noel sings when he awakes, the unintelligible words that one by one will blossom into the new language?" Unquote. The reference to a child singing, which produces sounds which will form into language, recalls the infant's innate creativity in first acquiring language. In Ian McEwan's novel The Child in Time, Stephen is participating in a committee claimed to be formulating the government's authorised childcare handbook. One of the experts called to speak to the committee, Professor Brodie, is a man who resembled an ape, who argues that introducing literacy to children less than 11 years old, quote, introduces a degree of abstraction which shatters the unity of the child's worldview, drives a fatal wedge between the word and the thing that the word names. Professor Brodie tells the government committee that the apprehension of the unity of creation is a gift to us in childhood, and we must not wrench it from our children with our anxious, competitive education, with our busy, intrusive books. This view is taken from the writer Joseph Chilton Pearce, who is one of those acknowledged by McEwan as an influence on the novel. Pearce's concept of a magical child who can empathically connect with the world, and further can develop this connection so that his mind can affect the world, can be seen as a version of the romantic child ideal. I would say Pearce is a very interesting writer, someone that people maybe have forgotten about these days, but is well worth going back and checking out. Pearce asserts that our attitude towards developing and educating children is actually damaging them. He argues that we are all born with an innate connection to the natural world, and that this is ruptured by introducing literacy at too early an age. Pearce argues that there are several stages of human development, roughly coinciding with the stages that the influential biologist Jean Piaget posited. Pearce argues that a child's mother is his initial matrix, the site through which he experiences the first stage of development. The father's role is a bridge from mother to the world somewhere in that second year of life and to the larger world of society around age 7. The father draws the child out from a symbiotic kind of relation with the matrix into ever larger matrices. In this early novel by McEwan, he is seemingly influenced by his then relationship with Penny Allen, a spiritual healer and also becoming a father during the writing of the novel. In the novel, in contrast to his later writing and statements in interviews, he references spiritual texts such as William Blake's alongside quantum physics. David Bohm, who in books such as Wholeness and the Implicate Order and On Creativity discusses theories of quantum physics and considers them alongside ancient spiritual beliefs, is another person that's referenced in the book and has an influence on the narrative and the content. Bohm argues that what we perceive through the senses as empty space is actually the plenum, which is the ground for the existence of everything, including ourselves. He is also referenced in the text itself when the physicist Fermat says she is with the optimists like my colleague David Bohm, who anticipates a higher order of theory. This new theory would refer to a higher order of reality, a higher ground, the ground of all that is, an undivided whole of which matter, space, time, even consciousness itself would be complicatedly related embodiments, intrusions which made up the reality we understood. Bohm has applied his theory to contemporary social issues, which he argues are caused by a worldview for most people that is divided and selfish, in opposition to the actual wholeness of the universe. A divisive and selfish social and political world is certainly critiqued by McEwan in The Child in Time. In that novel, the lost child is presented as a symbol of this division, the emptiness below. The references to a higher order of reality, including spiritual texts as well as quantum physics, suggest that the lost child figure also symbolises a fracture of reality which opens a void between the material and something more profound. And it's this that I will go into more. I think the lost child is this fracture between time, reality, and our consciousness. Such theories are also explored in Tom Stoppard's 1993 play Arcadia. In the year 1809, the child prodigy Thomasina discusses with her tutor Septimus the burning down of the great library at Alexandria. The girl bemoans the terrible loss to human culture of all the accumulated knowledge. He argues instead that the knowledge is still out there, has always been present, and is waiting for the right moment in time to be manifested in the human world again. Quote, "We shed as we pick up, like travellers who must carry everything in their arms, and what we let fall will be picked up by those behind. There is nothing outside the march, so nothing can be lost to it. The missing plays of Sophocles will turn up piece by piece, or be written again in another language. Mathematical discoveries glimpsed and lost to view will have their time again." Unquote. Thomasina will sadly be consumed by flames herself, robbing the world of the discovery, many years before the actual revelation in the 1960s, of chaos theory, the numerical ripples and patterns that are the basis of the physical interactions of the physical world. The death of Thomasina has its own ripples and effects. Septimus goes mad, becoming a hermit, desperately scribbling formulas to try and turn back time and recover the lost child. In the modern day, the relevance of Thomasina's scribbled sequence of numbers only becomes apparent when they're run through a computer, the new technology extrapolating the fragment on into infinity, another scientific example of multiple dimensions emanating from a single point. Stoppard interweaves his scenes between past and present to symbolise Septimus's assertion that in the movement through time, knowledge becomes lost and then found again. Time can't be reversed in the physical world, as Septimus' despairing madness shows. The lost child consumed by flames cannot return, but the memory of her creativity, her imagination can continue to affect the world and inspire those who came after her. The inspiration of creativity is the positive manifestation of the cycle of life. Sadly, so much of our society is instead locked in a perennial mutation of lost childhoods. The cycle is one of loss, childhood abused, neglected, deprived, often growing up to inflict abuse, neglect or deprivation on future children. Although Thomasina herself is very articulate, the character Gus in the 20th century sections of the play never speaks. As with many lost child texts, Arcadia's plot switches between past and present, and Gus is a link between the two eras, emphasised by the character being played by the same actor as the flamboyant brother of Thomasina, Augustus, in the 19th century. Gus's silence is also represented as timeless, like the unspoken stories which are often suppressed but sometimes emerge to disrupt established histories. Cousin argues that Thomasina resembles Gus because both characters transcend their time. At the end of the play, it's Gus who wordlessly brings the researcher Hannah Jarvis a picture drawn by Thomasina of a tutor, Septimus, which proves that he was the mad hermit discussed earlier. Gus is an odd, silent, occasional presence. Though he never speaks, he understands things that the other characters don't. Stoppard, in an interview, said that Gus represents, quote, something more mysterious than a mechanistic universe, but it was impossible to say what. Stoppard said that Gus is about as far as I'm prepared to go into metaphysics. He is representative of the profound state of silence, which is beyond language and is not restrictive like the forms of silence enforced by fear and control. It's also a state which is outside of science. As Stoppard has said, he does not believe science is the ultimate truth of the world. Science, like language, attempts to define the physical world and all stages of existence. But Stoppard argues that there must be mystery for science to have truth, and I argue there must be silence for language to be profound. Thomasina will die in a fire on the eve of her 17th birthday, and Septimus will be driven insane and spend the rest of his life producing mathematical formulas which reveal the melancholy certitude of a world without light or life, which equates in the modern world to the second law of thermodynamics, that heat must be lost and can never be reversed, and that a system must decline into disorder. He too will be without discourse or companion, outside of human language and society. Although he was presented as mad, Septimus the Hermit is attempting a recovery of the lost child. He is looking for the underlying patterns of existence that are outside of language. However, Septimus is also seeking the restitution of hope, trying fruitlessly to reverse time and bring back Thomasina. The attempt to reclaim the lost child cannot be successful, at least in the form that existed previously. Thomasina, the flesh and blood girl who died on the cusp of adulthood, will never return to the material world. However, when her equations are extrapolated millions of times through a computer in the 20th century, they produce patterns making themselves out of nothing. Thomasina has attempted an equation which will reproduce an apple leaf, because she argues if nature is written in numbers, and there is an equation for a curve like a bell, there must be an equation for one like a bluebell, and if a bluebell, why not a rose? In the 20th century, her equation does not mean the world is saved after all, because the physical laws of entropy mean that the world, as everything, will cool down. However, if this is how it started, perhaps it's how the next one will come. There is here hope that around the lost child, through love, there can be a way back out of the void. As I've discussed earlier about trauma and social deprivation and the anxiety and problems in society being around the lost child, and then going on through Arcadia about and Child in Time, looking at the philosophical, if you like, metaphysical disruptions, reality and time that are again around the lost child figure. These are themes that are prevalent quite a lot in our culture. Geraldine Cousin analysed many diverse theatre productions in Britain between 1990 and 2005 and found that many concentrated their narratives of trauma and anxiety around the lost child. She argues that the lost children in the play she discusses are, quote, markers both of a private pain and a profound uneasiness about our communal future, and argues that theatre exists here and now and then, sometimes disturbingly it's gone. Perhaps paradoxically, Cousin sees this precariousness as appropriate for staging representations of our society as it is now. She views the society in which these plays were produced and staged as one in a constant state of anxiety. And I believe the lost child figure is itself about uncertainty, anxiety, fear and disruptions in time. Cousin also discusses how several of the productions around the turn of the century adapted stories from fairy tales. For instance, a play by Brian E. Lavery called Frozen, not to be confused with the later Disney film, adapts Red Riding Hood to a modern-day abduction and murder of a child. This was first performed on the 1st of May in 1998. Cousin contextualises the play with journalists' accounts of the murders of Sarah Payne, which happened in July 2000, and of Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells in August 2003. Payne was abducted and murdered on the way to her grandmother's house, as was the character in Frozen. This recalls, of course, Red Riding Hood's journey, but with a terribly real outcome. Cousin refers to Nicky Gerard's assertion that Ian Huntley's murder of Wells and Chapman is like a nasty modern fairy tale. And Cousin argues that the murders that we respond to most strongly are the ones that we can frame within recognisable, if disturbing, narratives. And of course, an aside to things that we know about how what's perceived in the media and what's shown in the media may not be the whole truth. It may well be that people in power are tapping onto those narratives and framing them in a certain way to tap into this underlying consciousness that we have. The public, consumers of media and culture, are often most strongly affected by those murders and abductions which are presented to us in the form of a narrative that connects consciously or unconsciously with the stories that have framed the history of our culture. An inner core of dread remains constant. This constant inner core of dread is represented by the figure of the lost child, and I've argued that the figure has been around for centuries. However, as I'm writing now, it's not surprising that the figure of the lost child should seem to haunt our society increasingly. Of course, people of previous times had to suffer at least as many horrors and hardships as we do. The difference is the increasing glare of media images and the constant soundtrack of words.
So Mark's just asked me to tape what I just said to him, because I paused when he was recording and just reminded him that I'd read somewhere that Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman thing. I don't have a very good memory, but I remember that, and I remember every single thing about them. I read somewhere that they were taken to an army military base, some conspiracy theory, which I read somewhere, but anyway. I was on holiday in a caravan when that happened. My boys were only little, but I read everything there was about that. I then came home and I went on, there was message boards, and I remember writing on the message boards. It was like a commemorative message board where you'd light virtual candles and things like that. It affected me as if it had been my children, and just thinking about it now, I was nearly in tears just a minute ago. I remember every single bit. I remember their Manchester United t-shirts. I remember what the parents looked like. I remember every single detail of every single photograph of everything about that. And I said to Mark, the lost child, I said, are you going to start talking about the shadow and young? Because that's where the lost child is. The lost child is in the shadows of ourselves. It's our scariest, the things that we will bury and will not think about. And I said to Mark, when there's something like this fairy stories, and also like these deaths of children, it's like somebody's delved right down deep into the subconscious, which is always it's always depicted as deep water. So I said to Mark, it's like when you come up from deep water too quickly, you get the bends, don't you? You get ill, you can die from that. It's like a sharp shock. So I said, when there's this murder, what happens is something has gone right down to the very depth of your subconscious, where all the monsters and the fears and everything that you never want to confront ever, death of a child, lurks, and they grab it and they pull it up to the surface, and it's out in the open and it's gasping for breath, and it can overwhelm you and kill you. And I think that was it, wasn't it? Mark just said tape it.
Yeah, it's getting to the heart of what I talked about, so I thought it was really important to have it recorded. But yeah, one of the most shown, and again there's the red dress or red top, following Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, the famous Man United top picture which you just seen. So again, there's this link with Red, the Little Red Riding Hood motif. Again, seems to keep reappearing. The choice of particular images to show is definitely deliberate, I think. I mean, McCann was allegedly abducted on May the 3rd, 2007, which is my birthday, so that's a sort of a vague personal connection to it, which maybe has partly again put things in my head around this topic. Her image and the story was so widespread in the British media, but it went far beyond that and became a worldwide phenomenon, which, you know, is strange again to think of, when sadly each country will have its own lost children, very real stories, which won't probably have got the same exposure in their media as this child that, you know, was abducted a long way away. I mean, I read reports, there was lots in the media in Australia, for instance, and things like that, and the reports of it seemed to be connections there around notions of nation and things like that. A famous story was where a picture of a blonde, blue-eyed girl with an Arab family in North Africa, taken by some tourists, and it was, well, you know, this could be Maddie. The obvious seeming contradiction of a blonde, blue-eyed girl with an Arab dark-skinned family, and but it turned out that she was a genetic child of this family, and I think it brought up so many things in the media with how it was used, and all these sort of racial conflicts, and there was obviously so much in the media in Britain attacking the Portuguese police and various controversies around that, and within Portugal I think there was a lot of controversy, reports where they couldn't understand how parents could leave such young children on their own, and I know that's not something that's just confined to Portugal, but all these ideas of stereotypes of national identity, race, and of course the media here played it out in terms of the relationship with Europe and that sort of thing. So again, you see how a lost child image can be used, and can the power, the emotions that it dredges up, as Liz was saying, can be used for so many political and social manipulation. I'm not going to go too much into the details of the alleged abduction and what's behind it. I mean, I would recommend people look at Richard D. Hall's incredible in-depth analysis of all the things behind the story and the presentation within the media, and the stories that were given by the McCanns, and it's very clear that again things were totally not what the official story was presented as. I mean, just the fact that the press secretary of Tony Blair at the time, Clarence Mitchell, supposedly suddenly decided that he would give up that post to be the press spokesman for the McCann parents. Just something that is unimaginable, and why would Tony Blair's press spokesman go out to Portugal in the first place for an abduction case which, again, as I've said before, tragically is not one of many hundreds, thousands that happen, and which, and obviously none of the others get anywhere near the same exposure. So that makes you think that there is something very much deeper behind the facts about what happened there with McCann. So, I mean, just to go from that, just to look at some more analysis of the images of children and how they can be used, or how they get how they affect society, this writer Conrad argued that the emblematic child, both good and bad, frequently occupies a space where there was once a real child. Real children are mute and absented, and easily confused and replaced by photographic or imagined representations. We revel in the images of imagined good kids and in the stories of bad kids, but we increasingly spend less and less time with real kids. The images of bad and good children become forces which influence the policies of those in power, enabling decisions to be made which can actually endanger real children. These images act as a screen behind which real children are obscured and lost. The imagined child can consume the real, living children of society and therefore become a self-perpetuating symbol, which through the actions of policymakers and with the collusion of unquestioning society members can actually create the circumstances by which more lost children are created. In the media and state-produced images described by Conrad, the image floats free of an already lost child and is used to manipulate and control it, because the child is what we understand as interiority, what's inside us, the self. Going back to what Liz was saying about the shadow, it therefore becomes the vehicle for powers to change and control the thinking of the population. The number of extremely high-profile cases of child disappearance, abduction, abuse or murder which have become such a focus of society's horror, even panic, over the loss of a child mask a far larger number of unreported and collectively forgotten lost children. Whether the cause is external or internal, it's a product of the world we all live in, and our society seems fearful of witnessing the absence of children while simultaneously desperate for an opportunity to mourn the removal of the child from its presence. The lost child signifies to us that there are huge gaps in our world, which we try to ignore and pretend are not there, yet people disappear through them all the time. The fictional texts discussed here react to the horrors in the everyday world and portray these gaps. However, I regard these texts as not merely reflective of tragedy in the material world, but symbolic of a metaphysical trauma, because when children are lost, particularly when their continued existence is uncertain, their absence from the current material world and time means that they actually have a presence which is beyond time and place. In recent cases where media exposure of a lost child has propelled his or her image around the world into thousands of homes, that presence is felt intimately by people who had never met the lost child in person, as this was describing. This aspect of the universality of the lost child figure is felt in the novel The Child in Time, where Stephen sees his daughter in others. Quote, any 5-year-old girl, though boys would do, gave substance to his daughter's continued existence. He imagines Kate's spirit, how it might hover high above London before descending to a playground or street corner to inhabit the body of a young girl, infuse it with its own particular existence before moving on, leaving the empty shell, the host, behind. This passage brings up a question relating to the symbolic use of the figure of the lost child. This symbol has a connection to real-life lost children because it's an imaginative representation of their existence and absence. The real children are individual, and each case where one is lost is a tragedy for them and for anyone who knows them. However, their trauma is linked to the symbol of the lost child, which hovers not only above the material world but also within and beyond it. In The Child in Time, Stephen's daughter Kate is abducted in a supermarket, a fitting venue considering the consumerist, avaricious society which McEwan condemns. Obviously, it's written in the 1980s, so he did it as a critique of Thatcherite Britain. The lost child has become a commodity to be marketed and promoted. The child, when considered to be suitable, can become a lucrative product for the profusion of media outlets around the world who need column or screen inches to be filled, copies to be bought, pages viewed and subscribed to. National newspapers in the UK added tens of thousands to their circulation after they started reporting the McCann disappearance. The child in the appropriate image is replicated throughout the world and becomes a virtual sacrifice for the population to focus on and be manipulated. So Liz made another stunning point to encapsulate my work of decades in a few words and bring it all to an emotional high point. But it have those as I said, where so many images where the modern abducted children, Holly Wells, and Madeleine McCann, shown in red, the same as Red Riding Hood, and it's very much symbolic of the fact they're taken before or around time of puberty, and all those symbolic connotations with blood, and as Liz said, because they were taken at that stage, they couldn't reproduce, so it's not only a loss of the child themselves, but any future child they may have when they became mothers, if they could become mothers. And this will feed in with a point that I'm going to make later on. But the symbolic nature of the sacrifice, just going on to another novel by Emma Donoghue, which received a lot of accolades, was made into a film entitled Room in 2010. A young woman's been imprisoned in a room since she was a teenager, abducted by a man she names Old Nick, which made me think of sort of Santa Claus and that sort of thing, but a perverted version of it. She calls him this to her 5-year-old son Jack, who was born in the room. He's never seen the world. He views outside as merely representation, believing it can only exist in television, stories and songs. This perception has been taught to him by his mother as a means of protecting her son from the harsh reality of their lives. So he can help them escape, his mother later tries to convince her son that the programmes he watches avidly on television are actually representations of a vast material world. It's then that the unreality of their own life, confined to a single room, must be highlighted by the mother. And she says, "We're like people in a book, and he, Old Nick, won't let anyone else read it." Room is the title of the book, and the characters are indeed trapped within its pages. The novel makes the reader question to what extent we are all contained within the structures that define our world, and asks, how do people in a book escape from it? When Jack does escape with his mother into the world, he's understandably overwhelmed by outside. Although he begins to enjoy some experiences, he still yearns to return to Room. Towards the end of the novel, Donoghue inserts a passage in which Jack sees part of a television discussion which is about him. Jack is surprised to hear them say, "We're all Jack in a sense, the inner child trapped in our personal room 101. An inner child who perversely on release feels alone in a crowd and reels from the sensory overload of modernity." A woman on the television programme asserts that at a symbolic level, Jack's the child sacrifice, cemented into the foundations to placate the spirits. Jack's grandmother angrily turns off the television with the remark that those guys spent too much time in college. And I accept, obviously, when I wrote my book and my academic work, I'm like one of those guys who spent too much time in college. But I think it is relevant, those things that were said. It becomes like the symbolism is important to note without losing sight of the human tragedy, but it's important because that's what the people in charge of us, manipulating us, they are using these symbols against us. So it's important to unpick them and know what's being done. So Donoghue herself, the author, said on her website that she was inspired to write the book, apart from her own looking at her own 5-year-old child. It was also inspired by ancient folk motifs of walled up virgins who gave birth, e.g. Rapunzel, often to heroes, e.g. Danae and Perseus. Room was also inspired by the Fritzl family's escape from their dungeon in Austria, though I'll doubt I'll ever use contemporary headlines as a launching point again, since I didn't like being even occasionally accused of exploitation or tagged Fritzl writer. So the novel's narrative is a mixture of the symbolic from nursery tales and legends and contemporary headlines. So it's what I'm talking about here, the combination of the real, the media manipulation and ancient stories and the unconscious. It's impossible to divide the representation from the real and argue that one would not exist without the other. We're all contained within a narrative, and we need to create our own story, but increasingly we are being governed by imposed narratives and agendas from those with power. Just to go back now to Geraldine Cousin and her analysis of theatre productions in Britain between 1990 and 2005, she noted that amongst all those plays there was several restagings of ancient Greek plays, such as Medea, where the character Medea killed her own children. And she also discussed how there were 3 productions of another play by Euripides called Hecuba, and they were in the months following the massacre of school children in Beslan, which I think is in Chechnya in 2004. So Hecuba details atrocities in ancient Greek wars around 400 BC, and one of the programme notes to a staging of the play in April 2005 compares an incident where invaders from Thrace in the time of Euripides killed all the children in a school, and compared it to Beslan, the current tragedy of similar, also in a school. And sadly that terrible incident is not the only school massacre. When I was writing my book, there was a massacre of 145 people, including 132 children, in the army public school in Peshawar in Pakistan on the 16th of December 2014. Children sadly seem to be targeted as a symbolic sacrifice, as a vulnerable centre of a community, to enable the invaders to destroy the will of the people in the place they're invading, perhaps hold hostages to manipulate and control them through fear, and more through actually striking at something which is the soul of life, the new beginnings that are supposed to hold hope for a future. And of course we know about in America these school shootings which have been repeatedly staged, and the resultant media and political rhetoric that's sought to use the deaths to instigate changes in society. And we will obviously know again from lots of people that we've studied about how these things are manipulated deliberately, whether people are killed or not, to try and again get an objective by the people in power. There are legends in societies throughout the world and through history of practices of child sacrifice to destroy the will of the population, to resist their rule and increase their own power. As mentioned in the Room passage, there have been reportedly practices in some societies where dead children were put in the walls of buildings to somehow reinforce them and bring luck to its occupants. Much of this could be created by the people invading a country to reinforce the concept that the defeated people were barbaric and somehow deserving of being overthrown and civilised. So these, as has been talked about by Thomas Sheridan and others, where practices of human sacrifice have maybe been embellished and created to just create a negative view of people of pagan followings as part of the overthrow of those religions. However, as Josephine McDonough also argues, the brutality and callousness which empires allege on their victims is often simply a reflection back on their own violent practices. It's one of the properties of the lost child figure that we are presented with the outcome of the darkness inside of our worlds. So even if the sacrifices of humans are more legend than fact, that in itself shows the beginning of propaganda, how this happened centuries ago to shape thought, and that this has inhabited the unconscious of us today, so that these ideas of child sacrifice are contained within us and are come out in different forms. There is an unspoken, abhorred but respected tradition that at least some children must be sacrificed for the powerful, to be given in tribute to our gods, those who rule us from the shadows. So what on the screen now is a classic silent era Italian film called Cabiria, which is released in 1914
obviously a very significant year, and it's set around the Second Punic War, and as part of its plot is about an abducted child, and it also has this scene of children being sacrificed into a furnace in the form of the god Moloch. People will probably be aware in this audience of the Bohemian Grove ceremonies, where we have the supposed great and the good of America, at least, in full-on creepy robes in a ceremony in front of a statue of the same Moloch, the same god that's represented here. There are, of course, many allegations of actual sacrifices and satanic practices going on at Bohemian Grove, but even if they are just acting out a version of an old ritual, why is the most powerful people in the country, or some of the most powerful people in the world, supposedly rational, factual people, taking part in such a ceremony, which is linked, at least in legend, if not in actuality, with child sacrifice? The biggest ritual is known as the cremation of care, and although it was long denied, it's now been admitted that they do have these rituals at Bohemian Grove. Now, this film is also interesting in itself, because, as I say, it was released in 1914, and it was actually the first film to be shown at a special screening at the White House, on the lawn, for the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson. And I find it striking that a US president should be shown this film amongst all the others, and this scene particularly on the eve of the First World War, when so many of the youth of the world ended up dying. A striking and powerful image, and it sort of carries on to recent times as well. I'll just put up in a moment that there was headlines recently when Donald Trump was involved, or someone, social media said that he was standing again for president because he didn't want people dealing with child sacrifice to gain power. And this created a lot of headlines, obviously negative, saying, when he liked it on social media, that he was supporting conspiracy theories. But again, it was putting this idea out in the media of child sacrifice and of Moloch. So it's something that's very much back on the agenda, out front again. So yeah, and another couple of examples of in recent years as well of Moloch being out in the public view is the Vatican, who are apparently, I think, responsible, in charge of the Rome Colosseum, one of the most visited sites in the world. Several years ago, they commissioned a statue of Moloch, image here, that was put at the entrance to the Colosseum. So again, just putting something in full view. And also there was recently WikiLeaks, the Podesta Clinton emails. One of them, she was joking about, I'm going to go out and sacrifice some chickens to Moloch. As Liz says, it's sort of like they're just trolling us, really, and just ready to throw anything at us, and most people just look past it and just don't realise the significance of it. So to go on from that silent classic film, 1914, cinema has continued to show us the sacrifice of children. Dystopian futures have been presented to us involving games where children have to fight each other to the death as part of entertainment for the masses, in films such as Battle Royale from Japan, Maze Runner and The Hunger Games. The competition in The Hunger Games is portrayed as a sort of ritual which happens annually, where 2 children from 12 different sectors are chosen. These poor, starving communities are forced to send 2 children each to the rich, powerful capital as tribute, as punishment for a previous rebellion. The child that wins earns food and other rewards for them and their community. Obviously, David Icke has used the Hunger Games Society as an analogy for what's happening in our world, or what's planned for us. The successful films from the books that were taken from multi-million copy best-selling trilogy of novels by Suzanne Collins. Collins says she drew inspiration for the series from both classical and contemporary sources. So again, we got this link of the legendary Lost Child and the modern day. Her main classical source of inspiration is the Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, in which, as a punishment for past crimes, Minos forces Athens to sacrifice 7 youths and 7 maidens to the Minotaur, which kills them in a vast labyrinth. Collins says that even as a child she was stunned by the idea, since it was just so cruel to force Athens to sacrifice its own children. So she obviously internalised this from when she learnt about it as a child. She also cites classical inspiration from Roman gladiator games, which happened, of course, in the Colosseum, where I just said the Vatican put up a statue of Moloch in recent years. She feels 3 key elements create a good game: an all-powerful and ruthless government, people forced to fight to the death, and the game's role as a source of popular entertainment. A contemporary source of inspiration was Collins' fascination with reality television programmes. She says they are like the Hunger Games because the games are not just entertainment but also a reminder to the districts of their rebellion. On a tired night, Collins says that while she was channel surfing the television, she saw people competing for a prize and then saw footage of the Iraq War. She described how the two combined in an unsettling way to create her first ideas for the series. To go back to my outline earlier on how modern ideas of self, interiority, the subconscious and memory came bound up with the creation of the child image, if we consider that concepts, even if only in legend or child sacrifice, were part of the cultural legacy from much further back in time, within the oral folk tales of early societies and the ancient myths which entered the earliest forms of drama and literature in Greek, Roman and biblical times, then I would say this collective unconscious will have become internalised in our modern individual consciousness. There's a link between media and government in the novel The Child in Time, which I mentioned earlier, when Stephen, in the middle of his despair at his own lost child, watches a new all-day channel sponsored by the government and specialising in game and chat shows, commercials and phone-ins. Stephen chooses to forget his own inability to engage with society and with life and condemns the participants in the shows. Quote, "Was it any surprise the world was led by morons with these enfeebled souls at the ballot box, these ordinary folk, a word much used by the hosts, these infants who longed for nothing more than to be told when to laugh? Stephen tilted his bottle and sucked and was ready to disenfranchise them all. More than that, he wanted them punished, soundly beaten, no, tortured. How dare they be children?" Unquote. This type of television content is familiar to us now in the 21st century. McEwan was anticipating our current multitude of digital 24-hour channels. But, just going back to that quote, it's talking again about people being infantilized and this television becoming a sort of hypnotic thing, and how it's destroying democracy. I suppose you could look at it in a way, in terms of these people not having the cognitive skills or the will to question the people in power. So, lots of references to how the media is used to manipulate people, and that's something we're very familiar with now. I think it's significant. The Child in Time, although it's set in the near future from when it was written during the 1980s, published in 1989, and the 1980s was really where the beginnings of this satellite television, 24-hour news, these sort of things started to be a thing in UK and Europe. So I think it was a significant decade for many other reasons, socially, obviously with disruptions in communities and traditional industries that happened, but this media explosion, and of course the digital computer age was really starting to kick off in the 80s, the very beginnings of what we come to know now. And I'll talk a bit more about other elements around the 1980s as well. But in terms of the Lost Child of images, these become even more prevalent in our faces, and constant bombardment with 24-hour news and with the internet. It's enhanced the detachment of the image from the physical child, which, as Conrad said, perpetuates their throwaway and missing status. The lost child's image becomes an object of fantasy, a site of perverse pleasure, as the visual conversions of news, entertainment and advertisement tend to anaesthetise the horror. McEwan's passage above shows television as an anaesthetic, not in this case with images of children, but as a means still of divorcing people from reality, regressing them to a childlike state where they abdicate responsibility for their lives. Seemingly benevolent, sophisticated governments can control through manipulation of image and technology, fattening rather than doubling the world, suppressing thought rather than provoking it. Stephen's fantasy of torturing the people on the television is an example of the link to the more extreme physical forms of political oppression, indicating that one form opens a space for the other. I mean, I wrote that years ago, but we've seen that more and more in the current nonsense of the last few years, where you've had stuff on mainstream news where people are saying, oh yes, anti-vaxxers should be locked away, denied medical treatment, and worse. And this stuff, that sort of thoughts being put out into the universe via the media. Going from this talk about media and the images, you have the word in English reproduction, which is the action of or process of copying something. Of course, the other meaning of reproduction in English is giving birth, creating new life. Derrida's argued that the act of copying something, reproducing it, breaks the seal of authenticity, because by definition a written signature implies the actual empirical non-presence of the signer. So perhaps the double meaning of this word reproduction shows again the conflict that the lost child figure represents. The child is a replication of life, a passing of the genetic code and hope for continued progress in the family and society, but the lost child is a break from this continuum, a rejection of the ideal, a denial of progress, future life and growth. The seal of the natural order is broken, leaving things uncertain and anxious. Another French philosopher, there's so many, Baudrillard, argues in the late 20th century that the child has become a commodity, unfortunately unintegratable into the cycle of accelerated exchange, and hence become a non-standard product, an item from another age, floating most of the time between parents who no longer know what to do with it. He perhaps partly ascribes this to the way reproduction has become a technical operation, quote. However, I would argue that the systematic way that institutions, including governments, have sought to commodify the child as a unit of labour or objectify them and separated them at an early age from their biological families shows how recent technologies are only the latest in the line of systematic denial of childhood. Baudrillard asserts that a child in the late 20th century has become tantamount to a clone child who is conceived as an ideal outgrowth in your image. He refers to the actual scientific process of cloning, which is currently being planned, in his words. So I thought it was interesting to mention, coming on from the idea of reproduction and cloning, and with links to convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein, and this one of the bits of news that wasn't so publicised really, that came out after his supposed death or conviction. Obviously his connections with the powerful, but politicians, celebrities, etc., but also a number of scientists that he sort of got his grips into and that were on the list of people that went to his island. And he had this ranch as well, which I think
Sorrow Ranch.
Yeah, which I can't remember his name now, has talked about quite a lot. Jeffrey Bermas, Jason Bermas, that he's saying that they didn't. What happened at the ranch wasn't really investigated, or certainly not coming out in the court cases. But he dreamed of improving humanity with a baby-making ranch using his own DNA. So this went in the mainstream, that although they sort of said it was just a fantasy, but he imagined impregnating as many as 20 women at a time at his New Mexico ranch, distributing his DNA for the betterment of our species. Epstein is thought to have drawn inspiration from the ideology of transhumanism, manipulating or augmenting human genetics using technologies such as artificial intelligence and gene editing, according to the Times. So it was, well, they put it out in the mainstream, although they just put it, he was being delusional. But Epstein's plan had closer ties to a precursor of transhumanism, eugenics. This now discredited movement, once popular in scientific and academic circles in the Western world, also championed shaping a better human race through selective breeding for certain traits. However, so-called undesirable traits were generally those associated with minorities and people who were poor and uneducated. So over many years, Epstein wined and dined a number of notable scientists and peppered them with questions and his own opinions about human genetics, according to the Times. He invited scientists to lavish parties and dinners, sponsored their attendance at conferences, and even funded their research. Many of these gatherings, Epstein would talk to researchers about DNA, superior humans, and his plans for inseminating women at his ranch. It was not a secret, the Times wrote. The concept of eugenics, breeding an improved human race by encouraging only intelligent and healthy people to have more children, emerged towards the end of the 19th century in the United States and Germany. So it's interesting, this is in the mainstream because those who championed eugenics, as we will know, Courbet's, so many people have written about it, but what was eugenics after the Second World War, they changed the name and it went into the sort of depopulation, save the world by reducing the population types of Bill Gates narrative that we're getting all the Green New Deal. And also these concepts of degeneration with the human race, so associated with the poor and other races, centered around the need to control how children are produced. And Epstein, a convicted abuser of young people, was connected to the powerful and had plans to do this in a sort of cloning and manipulation of science. Just to follow on, in the one of the scientists, I don't know if you quite call him a scientist, but Steven Pinker was one of those people that was associated with Epstein, although he's vehemently denied ever going to the island, etc. But he's a linguist and someone who's, again, one of these people looking at a very materialist perception of the world, but very much around the idea of words. And he was actually involved in Epstein's, I guess it must have been his first legal defence in 2007, when he was brought in by the lawyers to sort of have a pedantic analysis of a particular statute, which Epstein was being accused of breaking around using the internet to attract minors over state lines for sexual abuse. But to me, it's just intriguing to mention in terms of language and how language is formed and how it can be used and manipulated as for deception and also for the for controlling and exerting power. So I thought it was just interesting to mention that in this regard as well.
Is that Stephen with a V?
Yeah, yeah, that's very important because there was a Stephen mentioning Graffiers, not sure how to pronounce her name, memoirs, and he denied that it was him.
Guthrie, innit?
Guthrie, that's right, because her Stephen that she mentioned had a PH in the spelling, and he said he spells it with a V. So the language is very important, down to the minutiae.
So Guthrie is one of the ones of the is the main accuser of Epstein, if you didn't know.
Yeah. So, just to go in what I previously talked about language and about this idea of doubling how writing, by the act of writing, you're sort of breaking a seal from something that the original thought or speech that's made, and this double nature of the signature, but the fact it can be reproduced means that it loses its authenticity. So that's, I think, important in terms of what I was just saying there about Pinker and the minutiae about language and how it can be manipulated.
and the importance of truth, and how it's difficult to nail down what is really true now. And for me, you know, the lost child is also in, as I discussed before about, we need to talk about Kevin. You know, it's also around this idea of this ambiguous, empty space within language and meaning. But you know, and where child murder was talked about before, where we said it's a puncturing of text which try to give an authority about what you know, what we should believe, and it's a way of smashing through that. I go on to images of Turn of the Screw and the film The Others. This idea of the ghostly, which seems like completely off tangent from language, but I think again it's this idea of the ghostly as something, it's a reproduction of the material, it's a representation, sort of an ephemeral image of the real. So again it's this breaking with reality and time, and so many stories, ghost stories, have children at the centre. Either the child is the human that is sensitive to the ghostly, and the ghost attaches himself often to a prepubescent child, and it's this idea that there's some flux within them that means that they're sensitive to the paranormal, different realities, different dimensions, and the child is more open and connected to that. And also there's a lot of ghost stories where the child themselves, the lost child, comes back as a ghost. So this again came out in these many theatre productions which were looked at by Geraldine Cousin at the late 20th century, and you know, references to it in the novels I've looked at, The Child in Time, the play Arcadia. So it struck me as well, just to go back to the 1980s, which The Child in Time talks about. There were so many narratives around disrupted time and reality around a lost child. We look at recent productions, TV series, where they've been set back in the 1980s. They've got sort of a retro story, and they decided to set them in the 1980s, and I wondered why was that? Why would they would choose to go back to the 1980s? I know, of course, you know, you could say, oh well, the people making it, that would be the time period maybe when they were children, so it's natural that they would want to set something, they'd be nostalgic. But I think there's more to it than that. I mean, I showed an image earlier of Stranger Things, which is set in the 1980s, maybe the best known, you know, one of the biggest TV series, obviously now on a streaming service in the modern way. But it references many films of the time, films again which are sort of like modern legends, you know, like E.T., Star Wars, these sort of things that have been the modern legends, the modern fairy tales that have come into our consciousness in the much more recent history. And that series, Stranger Things, starts with the character Will, lost in the woods, again a fairy tale motif, and he's transported to a different dimension, the upside down, a concept of reverse negative reality which we can all relate to with the way our world seems to be upside down from any sort of sense or reality of what we previously conceived as how our world was. The series also references MK Ultra, and the original working title for the series was Montauk, influenced by the alleged experiments conducted by US government involving trauma-based mind control and the development and abuse of the psychic abilities of some children to do remote viewing and other transgressions and manipulations of reality. So I wondered for a while about the 1980s. Something seemed to be standing out to me, drawing me to it. There were significant changes in society, like I mentioned earlier, with the technologies and TV, the media, how that all exploded. And that was mentioned, as I say, in Child in Time. And the dumbing down of people that comes from that, infantilization of adults, and also the premature aging of children, the sexualization of children.
and this has all gathered pace into our own time, but so many things came from the 1980s. But I think more fundamentally, we're talking about time and how that so many of these narratives talk about disruptions of time. Maybe there was a significant shift in perceptions of time and reality in the 1980s. And one thing that happened around that time was CERN, which came underway, I think, online around 1980 itself. Although there were earlier particle accelerators in different parts of the world that had been in operation in different levels, the biggest and most notable was started in 1980. It was CERN, and obviously a number of people have speculated that that has actually changed time and reality. So I think that's important to mention as well at this point. Thought it was relevant now to just put in this quote from Carl Jung. I think this stone is in the tower, his tower Billingen in Switzerland. Quite interesting inscription design on there, but the quote alongside it: "Time is a child playing like a child, playing a board game, the kingdom of the child. This is Telesphorus, who roams through the dark regions of this cosmos and glows like a star out of the depths. He points the way to the gates of the sun and to the land of dreams." So as an aside, I looked up Telesphorus, and he's in the ancient Greek religion a minor child god of healing, which I suppose that's relevant to coming out of darkness and renewing yourself, possibly assumed to have been a Celtic god in origin, and also was around in the Roman times. So lots of interesting connections there which are worth exploring maybe another time.
Right, I'm just grabbing this from him because he's just found out something else and he's just been spouting off all these Greek names, pronouncing them wrong. So in a nutshell, that Telesphorus, child god, helped out in an epidemic. That stopped him waffling on for 25 minutes. Thank me later.
So, I mean, talking about time, and I suppose there's so much narrative now of the end of times. So much seems like most of the things on Netflix are about apocalypse, Armageddon, and scientism, like a religion on its own, which says that conventional religions are such nonsense, but it has its own end times. With all this, climate change is going to destroy the world. Humanity's only got this long to exist, and all this sort of thing. So, just wanted to look particularly two classic dystopian novels: Margaret Atwood's *Handmaid's Tale*, now a TV series, and P.D. James' *Children of Men*, which was published in 1992, set in England in 2021, interestingly, and adapted by Alfonso Cuarón for a film in 2006.
And what colour are they wearing?
Well, yeah, red again in *The Handmaid's Tale*. In both narratives, a collapse in human fertility has precipitated social collapse, which has provided the opportunity for despotic rule. The absence of children removes any hope for the future, and humanity loses any continuity with itself. In our society now, even before the recent nonsense of the last few years and what's happened, from there was already a massive plummeting in fertility levels in men and women throughout the Western world. Although official sources claim they don't know what's causing it, it's obvious it's because of elements that are present in our world now that weren't so prevalent before. Whether it's chemicals, heavy metals, radiation, as well as the social factors of people being encouraged not to have children because of the impact on the planet, or fears for this or that, the anxiety in general caused, the fear that's pumped out all the time in the media. Otherwise, if it wasn't for all these things, that causing it, what else would be making such a dramatic change? And I would say that many in this science community don't want to find the causes because their science is the source of it, or the things that their science and technology have produced.
So, but it be admitting that science has created the means by which the future of the human race is under threat of extinction. And it's to admit the degeneration within our self-satisfied contentedness that we are reaching a peak of evolution. Like in the 18th and 19th century, death, or in this case the prevention of life beginning, and the decay and destruction of society are inherent within the means by which our society has supposedly achieved mastery of nature, or at least a detailed knowledge of its workings. Like building a Tower of Babel, we are sowing our destruction while believing we are becoming gods. The figure of the lost child is reproduced constantly in our cultures. It's haunted our past, it's haunting our present, and it's also the ghost of our future if we won't wake up to the void which is gaping beneath us. The destruction of children, the erosion of innocence, is still now being carried by some of the most powerful in society, and we look at allegations of things like adrenochrome and paedophile rings, which Epstein, Savile, these are proven examples of. These people create lost children in a tragic reality which goes back into our collective unconscious. The lost child is to me a Jungian archetype. While writing this lecture, I came across this passage of writing by Carl Jung. So this quote again at the Bellingen Tower, Carl Jung. I came across this quite recently when I was getting this lecture ready. I hadn't read it before, but it just seemed to strike to me chords with what I think of as this lost child archetype and what it signifies. I am an orphan, alone. Nevertheless, I am found everywhere. I am one, but opposed to myself. I am youth and old man at one and the same time. I have known neither father nor mother, because I have had to be fetched out of deep like a fish, or fell like a white stone from heaven. In woods and mountains I roam, but I am hidden in the innermost soul of man. I am mortal for everyone, yet I am not touched by the cycle of eons.